They found the footage on a Tuesday. A JAG investigator named Whitmore sat alone in a windowless room at Bagram Air Base, Afghanistan, watching the same 11 seconds of video for the 14th time. The timestamp in the lower corner read 0214 March 19, 2009. The grid coordinates beneath it read 34 South PU. The camera was mounted inside a UH-60 Blackhawk angled toward the cargo door, and the image quality was poor grainy green night vision, shapes more suggested than defined. But what happened in those 11 seconds was impossible to misread. A figure in ranger kit, small against the bulk of the operators around her, turned toward the door. Not voluntarily. The figure's harness straps separated in one clean motion, a knife Whitmore would later confirm a blade so sharp the nylon barely resisted. Then two sets of hands found her shoulders. And then she was gone. Swallowed by 7,800 feet of Afghan darkness, without a rope, without a parachute, without a single word spoken that the audio track could recover. Whitmore stopped the footage, rewound, watched again. The investigation would take 22 days. It would involve 4 separate agencies, 11 sworn depositions, and a classified appendix that would not be unsealed for 9 years. The evidence that broke it open did not come from this camera. It did not come from the operators who threw her. It did not come from the chain of command that authorized what happened that night. It came from a device the size of a thumbnail that a 27-year-old staff sergeant had pressed into a seam in the cabin wall 40 minutes before takeoff. She had known. Not everything, not the names of every man involved, not the full reach of what she was walking into. But she had known enough, and knowing enough, she had prepared. Because that was what her father had taught her in the flat-voweled, unhurried way he taught everything on a Georgia afternoon 16 years before she would need it most. Her name was Elena Harker, and she had already begun. F.O.B. Joyce sat in the Kunar province like a fist pressed into the side of a mountain. It was not a comfortable place. The elevation made breathing a conscious effort. The cold came early and stayed late, and the surrounding terrain, steep-walled valleys, ridgelines that blocked both signal and sight, had a way of making even experienced soldiers feel watched. The Peach River ran below the wire on the eastern side. The Hindu Kush rose to the north, indifferent and enormous. It was March 2009 and the war was in its 8th year. Elena Harker had been at Joyce for 14 months, attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment's intelligence and communications element. On paper, she was a signals technician with a secondary qualification in terrain analysis. That was accurate as far as it went. It did not go very far. She was 5'3", 119 pounds. Dark hair cut short enough to stay out of her eyes, brown eyes that moved constantly without appearing to the kind of eyes that were always solving a problem they hadn't yet announced. She had a stillness to her that men in her unit sometimes mistook for passivity, right up until the moment they understood it was the opposite. Stillness was not absence. It was conservation. Elena Harker never spent energy she didn't intend to spend. In 14 months at Joyce, she had contributed to the identification and disruption of 4 separate weapons trafficking routes operating through the Kunar and Nuristan corridors. Arms moving from Pakistani border crossings through intermediaries whose names kept changing toward end users who never left fingerprints. 4 routes, 4 closures. Each one a thread pulled from a network that did not like having threads pulled. She had done this quietly, methodically, in the way her father had done everything. SFC, Frank Harker 75th Ranger Regiment, had died at a grid coordinate in Kunar Province on October 14, 2003. Elena was 21 years old. She had been in her 2nd year at the University of Georgia, studying civil engineering, when the 2 soldiers appeared at her mother's front door in the early afternoon. She remembered the quality of the light that day, flat and white, the sky the color of old paper. She remembered her mother's hand finding hers before either of them spoke. She did not remember crying. She remembered being very cold, standing in a house that was 72 degrees. Frank Harker had served for 19 years. He had gone to Kunar because Kunar needed men who understood how to move through difficult terrain without leaving the kind of evidence that got people killed. He was 43 years old and he was very good at his job, and then he was not alive anymore, and the Army sent his personal effects home in a flat-rate box that arrived 6 weeks later with the postage meter still visible on the label. Among those effects was a green field notebook. Elena had carried it since 2004, the year she joined the Rangers, the year she decided the engineering degree could wait and the other thing could not. The notebook was soft from years of handling, its cover dark, where Frank's thumb had rested 10,000 times along the left edge. Most of it was logistics, supply, requests, call sign, rosters, KEAMS schedules. The language of operational paperwork, the texture of a working soldier's arms. But in the back in the last 7 pages, Frank Harker had done something different. He had sketched a series of grid coordinates, hand-drawn in pencil with small annotations beside each one, a symbol, a date, a word or two that read like shorthand for a language only he had spoken. 7 grids in total. None of them appeared in any official database Elena had been able to find. She had cross-referenced them against every intelligence product her clearance allowed, against historical movement records and mission logs from 2002 forward. The grids were clean, deliberately clean, which meant someone had kept them that way. She had never shown the notebook to anyone. The one person who might have understood it was SGM Warren Stills, Frank's closest friend in the regiment, long retired to a house outside Savannah, where he grew tomatoes and answered his phone on the second ring whenever Elena called. Stills had known Frank Harker for 11 years. He had been 2 kilometers away when Frank died. When Elena joined the Rangers, Stills had driven up from Savannah and met her at a diner off post and ordered coffee. He didn't drink and looked at her across the table for a long time before he said anything. What he said was, "Frank didn't want you doing this." Elena told him she knew. "He wanted you to be an engineer. He used to say the country needed more people who understood how things were built." "The country also needs people who understand how things are broken," she said. Stills looked at his coffee. "That's something Frank would have said." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "He didn't want them to make you into a weapon, Elena." That was his exact word. A weapon. He'd seen what that did to people carrying that weight. He wanted you to find the truth about things, not to be the instrument that ended them. She had thought about that word instrument for a long time afterward. It was why she had chosen Intel and Comms over the combat arms path her marksman scores would have opened. She held a first-class rating with the M24 sniper system, qualified at Fort Benning at the top of her cycle. The instructors had asked her twice about reassignment. She had declined twice politely, and the matter had been noted in her file and not raised again. Only one person at FOB Joyce knew about the marksman rating. Specialist Owen Tate had been her spotter during a training and rotation in 2007 before she transferred to the Kunar assignment. He was 26, lean, quiet in the particular way of people who processed information faster than they could usefully express it. His official role was signals and electronic intelligence, and he was exceptionally good at it. The kind of technician who backed things up automatically out of habit, the way some people check their pockets for keys. He had watched Elena shoot at ranges that made other trainees stop and look, and he had never mentioned it to anyone. She had never asked him to stay quiet. He simply had. That was the thing about Tate. He understood what was worth saying and what wasn't. In 14 months at Joyce, it had made him the most valuable person she knew. The briefing for Operation Iron Hollow was held at 1900 hours on March 18, 2009. 14 personnel in the room. 2 projectors, 1 satellite imagery, overlay 1 secure map board with acetate route markings in blue and red. Major Gareth Lund sat at the front, his expression carrying the particular neutrality of a man who had already decided what the meeting meant and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. Roland Fitch, that was the name on the target card. Arms broker, facilitator, regional coordinator for a network that had been moving military-grade equipment through Kunar for approximately 3 years. Stinger components. Romanian-manufactured anti-armor rounds. American-marked communications equipment with no legitimate explanation for its presence in a Pakistani smuggling cache. Fitch was not a fighter, he was infrastructure. He moved things and he knew people, and he was very good at not appearing on the kind of document that ended careers or lives. But he had grown careless in the last 6 months, or something had made him feel safe enough to be careless, and SR had caught it a pattern. He was moving through the Peck Valley corridor on a predictable schedule, predictable enough that Iron Hollow had a 73% probability of intercept. The ground element would be a 5-man Delta Force team led by Master Sergeant Derek Crane. Elena registered the name without reacting. Crane had a reputation that preceded him into rooms and settled there before he arrived, a record of operations in difficult places, a collection of qualifications that read like a checklist of the Army's hardest programs. He was in his early 40s, built like something carved rather than grown, with a face that had been rearranged enough times that it had stopped looking accidental and started looking deliberate. His call sign was Ironside. She had not worked with him before. She noted that. "Harker," Lund's voice. "Your aerial overwatch on this one, no ground component." She looked up from the map. "The Delta element needs the flight hours in sector, and I want someone up there who knows this terrain if things go sideways. You can guide them out." Copy, she said. Across the room, Tate found her eyes. His expression said nothing. That was how she knew he was thinking exactly what she was thinking. She had led 7 operations in the Peach Corridor. She had more hours in Canard terrain analysis than any other intelligence officer currently at Joyce. There was no professional reason to bench her from ground operations unless the ground operations weren't the point. She loaded double ammunition. Standard load was 6 magazines. She took 12. If she was only observing, she shouldn't need more than basic combat load. She took double anyway and told herself it was caution and knew it was something else. The briefing packet came to her 30 minutes before Wheels Up. She reviewed it in the equipment room, going through it section by section, the way Frank had taught her, read it like someone is lying to you, because sometimes someone is. She checked the approach vectors, the contingency routes, the designated extraction points. She found it on page 4. The alternate extraction route, secondary egress, to be used only in the event of primary route compromise, ran through grid 3 for SPU. She read it twice. Then she looked at the wall for a moment, at nothing, the way she looked at things when her mind was doing something it needed space to finish. Grid 3 for SPU was the 3rd coordinate in Frank Harker's notebook. She had not entered it into any system. She had not shared it with anyone. It did not appear in any official terrain product she had ever accessed. It had never been in a briefing packet, a route analysis, a contingency plan. 3 people had ever touched that notebook. Frank Harker was dead. Warren Stills was in Savannah. And Elena was holding a briefing packet that contained a coordinate that should not have existed in any official document. Someone had accessed something they should not have been able to access. She put the packet down. Her hands were steady. She made them stay that way. She went to find Tate. He was in the signals room, running pre-mission comms checks headset on back to the door. She knocked twice on the door frame, their signal, and he pulled one ear of the headset aside without turning around. You see the secondary egress on page 4, she said. A pause. Grid 3-4 SPU. That's not in any system. Another pause longer. No, it's not. Who pulled my personal file? Tate set down his headset. He turned around. He looked at her with the careful steadiness of someone deciding how much to say and concluding it should be everything. Someone accessed your classification jacket 2 weeks ago. The inquiry log shows it was cleared through operations level, which means Lund signed off. She looked at him. I noticed it when I was running the mirror backup, he said. I back up everything on a 6-hour cycle. Comms logs, access records, mission packets. It's habit. Does anyone know you do that? No. She nodded slowly. Outside, the rotors of the Black Hawk were beginning their pre-flight wind up the sound building, from a mechanical cough to something that filled the chest. Whatever's on those drives, she said, make sure it's somewhere they can't reach. Tate held her eyes. Already done. She left him there and walked to the flight line. In the equipment bay before she crossed the tarmac to the aircraft, she stopped at her kit and opened the side pocket of her pack. There was a flat case there, waterproof, that held items she had carried for 14 months without needing. She opened it and took out a small device, not much larger than a thumbnail, matte black with an adhesive backing. A micro audio recorder, voice-activated 48-hour battery. She had signed it out of the intelligence equipment cage 8 months ago and never signed it back in. The paperwork said it had been damaged and destroyed. She put it in her breast pocket and walked to the helicopter. The Black Hawk lifted off at 2300 hours. The Hindu Kush at night was something that had no adequate description in language meant for lower elevations. The peaks caught starlight and gave nothing back. The valleys between them were absolute black in a way that suggested not absence of light, but presence of something that had swallowed it. Elena sat near the cargo door with her back to the forward bulkhead, the door gunner to her left, the Kunar province spreading below in the green-tinted language of her night vision. She knew this terrain the way most people know their own neighborhoods. Not from maps were someone's interpretation of a place, and interpretation was always incomplete. She knew it from movement, from the actual feel of elevation change in the legs, from the specific smell of the Peak River in different seasons, from the way sound traveled differently depending on which side of a ridgeline you were standing on. Frank's notebook had given her entry points to parts of the terrain that no one had officially mapped. She had walked all 7 grids in her first year at Joyce Awunanon on days designated for administrative stand-down. She understood now why he had kept them off the books. Across the cargo bay, Crane's team sat in practiced silence. They were professionals. The way they held their weapons, the economy of their movements, the positions they had chosen in the aircraft, all of it spoke to years of accumulated operational instinct. She respected it without trusting it. 20 minutes out, Crane stood. The movement was casual, unhurried. A man stretching after a long sit, rolling his neck, adjusting his kit. Elena watched it from the edge of her peripheral vision and felt the temperature of the moment change in a way that had nothing to do with altitude. His hand rested on his knife, not reaching for it, just resting. Harker. His voice came through the headset, conversational above the rotor wash. You know what your problem is? She turned her head slightly toward him. Tell me. You're too effective. He moved a step closer. In the green peripheral wash of her NVGs, she could see the others shifting, the subtle repositioning that was not random. Angles were being covered. Fields were being managed. 4 routes in 14 months. Fitch is running out of corridors. He takes that personally. I take IEDs personally, she said. Crane almost smiled. Fitch is paying $200,000 to solve his problem. Split 5 ways, that's a clean 40 each. His hand came off his knife, not to attack, to gesture as if explaining something reasonable to a reasonable person. Nothing personal, Harker. You're the best operator I've seen in this province in 8 years. That's exactly why you're the problem. The pieces assembled themselves with a clarity that felt almost physical. The benching from ground operations, the secondary egress through her father's grid, the double-checking that had put her on this aircraft and no other. She had been positioned, not by accident, by design, through the operational authority of a man sitting right now in the FOB Joyce command post. Lund, she said. Crane said nothing, which was confirmation enough. She thought about Tate, about the 16 minutes he had said he needed. How long has Lund been on Fitch's payroll? Long enough that the arrangement is stable. Crane reached up and pulled the crew chief's knife from its scabbard mounting on the bulkhead. The blade was black, non-reflective, the length of a forearm. I'm sorry about your father, Elena. I served in this province in 2003. Frank Harker was a good man. He would have understood that war is commerce. The harness straps parted in one motion. She had approximately 1 second before the hands came. She used it to exhale, to clear her lungs, to make the single decision that everything after would depend on. Not to fight, not yet. There was nowhere to go in the cabin, and fighting 4 men in a confined space at altitude was a calculation with one outcome. She let the hands find her. She felt herself lifted, her feet leaving the deck, the door yawning beside her with the Hindu Kush beyond it in the greenwashed dark. Should have stayed home, Ranger, Crane said. She was already calculating. The Peach Valley below her, the river running north-northeast, snowmelt high visible as a faint silver thread in the moonlight through her NVGs. She spread her arms and legs before she had even fully registered the fall instinct in training, converting panic into aerodynamics. Stable arch position, arms angled at 45 degrees. The body becomes a surface. The surface becomes a tool. Terminal velocity from altitude in a stable position was somewhere between 115 and 120 miles per hour, 7,800 feet below, approximately 40 seconds. She began to work. Frank Harker had taken her to a quarry lake in Carroll County, Georgia, in the summer of 2003, 4 months before he died, though neither of them knew that then. She was 21. He was standing on a rock ledge 40 feet above the water in civilian clothes, looking entirely unremarkable, and he had just pushed her off. She came up sputtering and furious, and he was standing on the ledge, still looking down at her with an expression that was partly amused and mostly serious. What did you learn, he said. You pushed me, she said. Yes, what did you learn? She had thought about it, treading water, the anger cooling into something more useful. Angle, she said finally. My entry angle was wrong. I rotated too far forward. He nodded. Not warmly, Frank Harker expressed approval through the absence of correction. 40 feet is survivable if you enter correctly. 400 feet is survivable if you enter correctly. The water doesn't care how far you fell. It only cares how you arrive. 8,000 feet. A river below her and 40 seconds remaining. She tracked the silver thread of the patch in her NVGs, calculating current, calculating approach angle, calculating what she could control and dismissing what she couldn't. The patch ran wide here, fed by snowmelt from the upper Kunar. Deep enough if she found the right channel. 20 seconds. She rotated her body slowly, using arm position to control the turn from horizontal to near vertical. Feet first angled slightly forward, 42 degrees from true vertical. She pulled her rifle tight to her chest, locked her ankles, positioned both hands to protect her face and temples. She was not afraid. Or perhaps she was, and it simply did not matter at the speed she was moving. 10 seconds. The river stopped being an abstraction and became a thing with specific features. She could see the pale foam at the boulder fields upstream, the darker current of the main channel, the way the moonlight caught the surface at different angles. She picked her spot. Main channel 40 meters downstream from the nearest rock formation. 5 seconds. She took the deepest breath of her life and held it. The Peach River hit her like a wall that gave way at the last possible moment. The shock traveled from her feet up through her legs and spine in a wave that tried to compress every joint in sequence. Her vision went white, then nothing. Then a roaring dark filled with cold, so absolute it ceased to feel like cold, and became simply a new condition of existence, something the body had no word for because no body was supposed to be here. She was moving too fast. Still descending through the water, the current pulling her sideways, her kit dragging her down with the intention of something deliberate. She hit the riverbed with enough force to crater into the silt. Rocks found her left shoulder, her helmet the back of her knees. Something in her left shoulder separated with a sensation she cataloged and kept moving past. She found the bottom with both feet, bent her knees against the river and pushed. She rose through the dark. Her head broke the surface 40 meters downstream from entry. She did not celebrate. She did not feel relief. She coughed out a mouthful of the peach and took one breath and then another and began moving toward the eastern bank before the current could make the decision for her. Her left shoulder would not respond correctly. Two ribs had made a sound during impact that ribs were not supposed to make. Her right knee was sending distress signals she placed in a queue behind more immediate concerns. She was alive. Above her, somewhere in the dark over the ridgeline, the Blackhawks' rotors were fading north. They would be back. When they came back, they would be looking for a body. She had no intention of giving them one. She pulled herself onto a gravel bar and lay flat for exactly 30 seconds to let her system verify nothing immediately fatal had occurred. Then she got up. The right knee tried to fold. She made it stop. Upstream, the first gray suggestion of false dawn was beginning to separate the mountain ridgeline from the sky. She had work to do. She gave herself 30 minutes at the riverbank. Not because she wanted to, because the body has a ledger, and the ledger had to be read before she could decide what was possible. Left shoulder dislocated. The joint had separated cleanly. She could tell by the specific quality of the pain, a deep wrongness rather than a sharp one, meaning the ball was out of the socket and the surrounding tissue was swelling in protest. She had 40 minutes, maybe 50, before the swelling made reduction significantly harder. She set it against a river boulder, using the rock as a fulcrum, and her body weight as the force working through it the way Frank had taught her. Slow rotation, constant pressure, breath counted out in fours. The sound it made going back into socket was wet and deliberate, and she bit down on her rifle sling and made no other noise. Two ribs on the right side moved independently when she breathed. Fractured, not broken clean. She used her rifle sling to create a binding around her lower chest tight enough to limit movement, loose enough to pull full breaths. It would not fix anything. It would prevent the fractures from becoming a puncture, which was the line between bad and unsurvivable. Right knee, the lateral ligament had partially torn on impact. She could walk on it. She could not run on it, not yet, not without risk of completing the tear. She improvised a stabilizing wrap from a strip of her undershirt, cinched it firm, and stood. Her right hand was shaking. She looked at it, the fine tremor persistent, the hand moving slightly against her will, with the rhythm of something that was not going to resolve quickly. It originated not in muscle fatigue, but somewhere higher up the chain. She could not address it here. The hand shook. She moved on. The river had carried her approximately a quarter-mile downstream from her entry point. They would search the immediate area first, the shallow banks, the obvious gravel bars, the downstream debris fields where a body would naturally collect. She had bought herself distance and time, neither of which she could afford to waste. She moved into the tree line and found a cluster of boulders with a natural overhang. She pulled the emergency blanket from her kit, sealed waterproof, surviving the impact intact, and wrapped it around her shoulders under the outer layer of her jacket. Not for comfort, for core temperature, which was dropping at a rate the body could not sustain without intervention. She could not light a fire. Smoke would be visible for 2 miles in still mountain air, and the air at 0300 in the Kunar was almost always still. The morphine injector in her kit would have been welcome. She left it where it was. She needed to think clearly more than she needed to stop hurting, and those two things were not compatible. She worked through the situation as it stood. Crane's team would report equipment, malfunction harness, failure, accidental egress. Lund would process the report and sign off. Staff Sergeant Elena Harker killed in a training-related equipment failure. Full military honors. A folded flag. They needed a body, or they needed to be confident enough in the terrain that not finding one was as good as finding one. She estimated 3 to 4 hours before they concluded the search and extracted. After that, Lund would begin managing the narrative, and any window for external communication would narrow rapidly. Tate was the only option. But Tate was inside the FOB under Lund's authority with no legitimate reason to initiate a secure outgoing communication at 0400. She thought about the mirror backups, the automatic redundancy that was simply his habit, the institutional memory of a technician who had learned that systems failed and preparation was the only honest response. She also thought about the recording device currently pressed into a seam in the cabin wall of a Blackhawk somewhere over the Kunar. She needed to stay alive long enough to matter. She started walking. She walked for 2 hours through broken karst limestone formations, weathered into an obstacle course that was nearly impassable in the dark if you didn't know it. Elena knew it. She had walked these specific formations twice in her first year at Joyce, following the third and fourth grids from Frank's notebook, and the knowledge lived in her feet as much as her memory. She covered 2 kilometers and found what she needed, a Soviet-era communications cache from the 1980s, long since stripped of anything useful, but structurally intact, a sandbagged hollow in the base of a rock formation, reinforced with timber that had dried to something near stone. She had noted it on her second ground reconnaissance and told no one. Inside, under a flat rock she had marked with a chalk line on her last visit, was a handheld radio, a Soviet R392 designed for short-range secure comms. She had found it 14 months ago, brought it back to life with a replacement battery, and cached it here. No transmit capability, the modulator was dead, but receive worked fine. She powered it on and scanned the operational frequencies she had memorized from the Joyce comms schedule. Then on Crane's team's designated tactical net, she found a conversation already in progress. 2 voices, Crane in the clipped shorthand of a man in the field, and the other flat institutional, the cadence of someone in a command post being careful about what he said and how he said it. Lund. She listened for 4 minutes. Most of it was compressed operational language designed to be uninterpretable to casual listeners. But Elena had spent 5 years learning to hear what operational language was trying not to say. Lund wasn't asking whether the mission had succeeded. He was asking whether the problem had been resolved. Crane was telling him resolution was still in progress, that the primary outcome was probable but not confirmed. Lund's response was the part that mattered. He told Crane additional time was available, that the search window had been extended under a cover story, that the FOB was currently processing a preliminary incident report that established the parameters of the official record. He was building the story in real time, constructing the administrative architecture of a death that hadn't yet been confirmed. Elena sat in the dark with the old Soviet radio against her ear and understood with a completeness that left no room for doubt that there was no version of the official record that would protect her. The report was already being written. She was already dead in it. And if Crane's team found her, the physical reality would simply catch up to the paperwork. She needed evidence. Not survival alone. Survival was necessary, but not sufficient. She needed something that could not be buried in a classified appendix. Something that would survive her if it came to that. She put the radio down and began moving again. The Blackhawk returned to the river at first light. She heard it before she saw it, then watched from her position as it settled onto a flat section of riverbank near the search zone. 5 figures emerged. They spread into a search pattern with the efficiency of people who did this well. She tracked them through her binoculars, the left lens cracked from the river impact, the right still functional. Crane was at the center, moving with the particular economy of a man who was also calculating, also thinking about the geometry of the situation. One of the figures, she made him as Doyle Mercer by his gait. The slight forward lean stopped near the gravel bar where the current had deposited debris overnight. He crouched down. She tracked his hands through the binoculars. He picked something up, her spare magazine pouch torn loose during the river impact. Mercer looked at it for a long moment. He did not hold it up for the others. He did not call out. He turned the pouch over in his hands once, then set it back where he had found it and walked on. Elena lowered the binoculars. She gave herself 2 hours to study the search pattern and understand its logic. They were thorough. They genuinely believed she might have survived the fall, and they were searching accordingly, which meant they understood something about who she was, even if that understanding had come too late. The terrain east of the Pek in this section was broken karst that Crane's team did not know, and she did. The Kunar had a particular type of slope formation. She had named them ledge breaks in her own notation, where the trail appeared to continue at a consistent gradient and then stepped sharply downward over a concealed limestone edge, the drop obscured by scrub growth. Local hunters knew them. Anyone moving through unfamiliar terrain at pace did not. The man she had identified as Sergeant Barker was moving fast, bringing up the rear of the search formation, and he hit the ledge break at a near jog. She heard the fall from 200 meters, the scramble of boots on limestone, then a sound with nothing voluntary in it, then the sustained silence of serious injury. The search paused. 3 men converged on Barker's position. The ankle was broken. She could tell by the way they immobilized it, by the stillness Barker maintained, that was not calm but shock-controlled pain. Now they were 4, and one of the 4 was carrying a casualty. She relocated before they finished treating Barker, moving to a new position on the ridgeline. The knee protested the climb with a pointed objection she declined to honor. The rifle had survived the fall. She had field stripped and cleaned it in the dark at the Boulder cache, working by touch. If you can't clean it blind, you don't really know it. The barrel was true. The optic had survived in its sealed case. She assembled it from the prone position using a fallen log as support for the injured shoulder and settled into the natural pause that existed between heartbeats. 760 meters. She had walked this terrain, and she knew the distances the way she knew her own hands, or had known her own hands. She watched Crane through the scope. He was standing on the riverbank, radio in hand, talking. Without that radio, his ability to coordinate with Lund to call in additional assets was significantly degraded. She aimed for the antenna. The shot required 4 adjustments instead of 1. She could feel the tremor in her right hand working against each correction, a fine oscillation consistent like a compass needle that had lost its north. She compensated through her left hand's grip, through the stock position, through adjustments to the natural pause that the tremor made harder to find. She breathed. She found the interval between beats. The antenna exploded in a shower of black plastic and static. 5 men hit the ground with the simultaneity of people who had been shot at before and had no philosophical objections to the dirt. Crane came up first, scanning, quartering the ridgeline in the systematic way of a man trying to reverse engineer the angle. He would not find her. She was already moving. The message had been received. She knew it had because she understood what it meant to a professional in this situation. Whoever fired that shot is alive, mobile, and capable of reaching you from a position you did not know was occupied. The psychological weight of that was heavier than the physical damage. She did not need to wound anyone. She needed them to understand the geometry had changed. She heard Crane's voice carry up the valley before she had moved 50 meters, not shouting, projecting, using the mountain acoustics. "Parker, I know that's you." She said nothing. She kept moving. She led them north for the rest of the morning, moving at a pace that kept her visible enough to follow and concealed enough not to target, appearing briefly at ridgeline transitions, allowing just enough observation to confirm her direction before disappearing again, drawing the pursuit where she wanted it to go, away from their helicopter, away from support, or deeper into terrain that was hers in a way that had nothing to do with assignment or orders. By midday, she estimated they were 2 kilometers from the Black Hawk. Then on the Soviet radio, she caught fragments of a new conversation on a frequency cycling through encryption. Crane was calling in support. Not FOB Joyce, not official channels. A separate frequency, the compressed structure of a request being made to a party outside the military chain of command. 3 individuals familiar to her from intelligence products she had helped prepare over the past year. Fitch's contractors moving toward her position from the east. She had been thinking about this as a bilateral problem. It was now a trilateral one. Private security assets, not bound by any protocols that made military opponents theoretically predictable, were approaching from a direction she had not accounted for. She stopped on a flat section of limestone and looked at the valley below and the ridgeline above, and the sky which offered nothing in the way of opinion. She needed the satellite phone before the contractors arrived, and the satellite phone was on the hip of a man 2 kilometers south who was actively hunting her. She started back toward him. The camp that Crane's team established that evening was professionally done. High ground, clear approaches, interlocking fields of fire, a rock formation to the north providing cover from 3 of 4 potential approach angles. They had designated the southern face as their entry and exit point, which meant it was the most heavily covered. She approached from the west. A dry creek bed ran parallel to the western face, cut 2 feet below surrounding ground by years of erosion, filled with rounded limestone pebbles that required deliberate foot placement but provided a channel invisible from above. She had been in the creek bed for 20 minutes when she identified Mercer on the western guard position. He was doing everything correctly. Irregular observation intervals, profile, small rock formation used to advantage. He was good, Elena was 40 meters from his position and still too exposed. She found a rock the size of her fist and rolled it along the creek bed, not thrown, just rolled, letting the surface carry it until it clicked against a larger stone with a sound that was small but distinct. Mercer's head came around. His rifle came up. He quartered the darkness to his southeast with professional thoroughness for a count of 8. Elena moved through the open ground in those 8 seconds, flowing into the shadow at the base of the rock formation, and stopped. She was in the camp. The interior was 4 meters by 6. 2 sleeping forms she identified Crane by his size on ground pads ranged for quick access to weapons. A portable battery pack with a charging cable, the satellite phone attached in a position that suggested habitual use. Equipment bags organized with the neatness of someone for whom order had long since become automatic. She crossed to the phone. 12 seconds to reach it. 2 seconds for what she needed. Delete the outgoing message to Fitch's contractors. Note the phone's unique identifier. Send a single compressed data burst to a number she had memorized. Then out. She was on her second when Crane's eyes opened. No groggy transition. From sleep to fully alert in the space between one breath and the next, the biology of a man whose nervous system had stopped wasting time on intermediate stages. His eyes found her in the dark with the directness of someone whose threat recognition was calibrated and current. They looked at each other. She had the phone in her left hand. Her right hand held the knife. The tremor in her right was still in that moment. The body sometimes resolved its symptoms under sufficient adrenaline, giving you one good window before the debt came due. Crane's hand began moving toward his sidearm, deliberately, with the control of a man making a calculation and communicating it to her, giving her the interval to respond before he completed the motion. She looked at his face. Something was happening in it she had not expected. Not the coldness of a man executing a clean decision, but something rougher, something that had been living with what it was doing long enough to have formed opinions about it. Lund has cover 4 levels up the chain, he said. His voice was very low. You have 1 specialist and a radio recording and a river story no one is going to believe. Tell me something I don't know, she said. The hand continued its slow progress toward the sidearm. Your father walked those grids in 2003 because he found something he wasn't supposed to find. He reported it up the chain. 3 weeks later, he was dead. Crane's voice had no particular emotion in it. The voice of someone reading a document. Lund was the reporting authority. The camp was very quiet. I've lived with that for 6 years, Crane said. Fitch's money felt like it made things simpler. A pause. It didn't. The hand reached the sidearm. Elena's knife covered the distance in one motion and pinned his right hand to the ground through the web between thumb and forefinger, the blade finding the space between metacarpals without touching bone, incapacitating without severing anything permanent. The sound Crane made brought the camp awake. She was already out of the rock formation and into the creek bed by the time the first light blazed. Behind her, Crane's voice cut through the chaos, the pain recalibrated into command. She did not look back. The satellite phone had completed its transmission in the 3 seconds between Crane's last word and his hand reaching the weapon. The compressed data burst had found its destination. What happened next depended on what Tate did with it. She ran. The knee made its objection. She overruled it and ran, and behind her the camp came fully alive in light and noise, and the Hindu Kush absorbed all of it with the indifference of terrain that had witnessed this particular human activity in one form or another for several thousand years. She ran until the noise was gone and the dark was complete again. Then she stopped, put her back against a rock, and breathed carefully around the fractured ribs. Tate had 16 minutes. She would give him those and more. She sat in the cold and counted them one at a time the way her father had taught her to count things that mattered not by the clock, which was external and therefore unreliable, but by the breath which was hers. At the cache, 2 kilometers north, she found what she had planned for a second satellite phone, sealed in a waterproof case, fully charged, the number for Tate's personal secure line, written in Frank's notation on a strip of tape inside the lid. He answered before the second ring completed. Tate, it's me. She heard the breath he released. I need you to listen and record this call. Already recording, he said. Where are you? North of the Peach, 2 clicks above your last known on Crane's team. They know I'm alive. Fitch's contractors are moving in from the east, 3 personnel, Crane called them in 20 minutes ago. She paused. Lund is coordinating from Joyce. Get that to someone above his authority before he completes his incident report. A silence. Then, how long do I have? However long it takes you. Elena. His voice was steady. This was what she had valued about him, not that he didn't feel the weight of things, but that he carried the weight and worked anyway. I have 19 months of mirror backups on a server that Lund has never touched. The file access logs on your personal jacket, the comms records from tonight, and your satellite burst just came through clean. I have everything. How long to upload? 14 minutes to a DoD external server outside Joyce's network. Then start now, she said. I'll keep them occupied. She cut the call and looked at the sky, which was beginning to lighten at its eastern edge. She thought about Crane's words in the dark of the camp. Lund was the reporting authority. 3 weeks later, Frank was dead. She had carried the shape of that truth for 6 years without being able to name its source. Now she had a name. Now she needed it to matter. She moved to a position on the high ground where she could see both the valley floor and the eastern approach and settled in to wait. The contractors arrived at first light from the east, moving in a loose tactical formation through the lower scrub. 3 men, civilian kit professional movement. She let them pass below her position, counting their interval spacing, calculating their objective. They were moving toward Crane's camp, not toward her. Crane had given them a grid, not a bearing, and the grid was where he had last known her to be. She did not engage them. She let them move. 14 minutes passed, then 15. Then Tate's voice came back on the satellite phone. It's done, Bewam. Everything is on the external server. I sent the access credentials to a JAG officer at Bagram through a channel Lund can't touch. A pause. Elena, there are helicopters spinning up at Bagram right now. Not from Joyce. She let out a long breath. Someone at Bagram received the upload and acted on it, Tate said. I don't know who, but the birds aren't Lund's. She reached into her kit and took out the emergency signal kit. The flare gun was a single-shot pistol grip, design matte orange, loaded with a 26mm Red Star cluster round. It was possible the helicopters were Lund's. It was possible Tate had been wrong about who received the upload. It was possible that the flare she was about to fire would bring aircraft operated by people who intended her death. She thought about her father's notebook and the 7 grids and the chalk lines she had drawn on the flat rock in a Soviet cache 14 months ago against a day she had not known was coming. She fired the flare. It climbed into the pale pre-dawn above the Kunar and burned there very bright, very red, making no argument and asking no questions, simply marking a location in the dark for anyone who was looking. She reloaded and waited and watched the sky. The flare burned for 41 seconds. Elena counted them from her position against the rock, and when it was gone, she began preparing for either outcome. If the helicopters that came were Lund's, she had one more flare and a rifle and a defensive position that favored her knowledge of the terrain over their numbers. If they were Tate's, she had a different set of problems, the kind that involved testimony and the institutional machinery of military justice, which was slower and less predictable than a rifle, but ultimately more durable. She heard the rotors 12 minutes after the flare died. Not one aircraft. 3. The acoustic signature resolved itself as she listened, 2 UH-60S and something heavier behind them. The distinctive two-bladed rhythm of an AH-64 Apache. Its sound lower and more deliberate. The sound of a platform designed to make decisions about what lived and what didn't. They were coming from the southwest, from the direction of Bagram, not Joyce. She held that for a moment and understood what it meant. Lund's authority ran through Joyce. Anything routed from Bagram had been taken outside his operational reach, which meant someone had made a call to someone above his pay grade before dawn on a morning when the official records still listed her as an equipment failure. Tate had made his 14 minutes count. The Apache came in first low over the ridgeline, its sensor package sweeping the terrain in the systematic way of a platform, doing what it had been designed to do. It passed directly over her position, and she did not move, did not attempt concealment, stood with her hands visible and her rifle slung. The sensor operators would see her either way. What they needed to see was a posture that communicated her intentions without ambiguity. The Apache circled once, then settled into a high orbit above the valley. The first Black Hawk came in over the river approach, flaring to land on the same flat section of riverbank where Crane's team had set down the morning before. Elena was watching through her binoculars and she saw the cargo door open before the skids touched ground. Owen Tate was standing in the door with his hand braced on the frame. She lowered the binoculars. The confirmation that she had been right about him, not the hope, not the assessment, but the confirmation settled into her chest alongside the fractured ribs and stayed there. She began moving down toward the riverbank. The second Black Hawk had not landed. She tracked it by sound, the aircraft moving northeast toward the elevation where Phoebe Joyce sat against its mountain. That aircraft was not here for her. She understood that too. The descent took 11 minutes. The knee had arrived at a temporary accommodation with the demands being placed on it, a negotiation rather than a resolution. She would pay for it later. She accepted the terms. Tate was 30 meters from the aircraft when she came out of the lower tree line, moving toward her with the controlled speed of a man who had been holding something in check for a long time. Behind him, she could see two medics coming down the ramp with a stretcher between them. She waved the stretcher off. Tate stopped 3 meters away and looked at her, the makeshift chest binding the shoulder that sat slightly wrong, even reset the knee wrap, the rifle still slung correctly, the hand still functional, and his face did the thing it did when he was processing something significant and had not yet decided how to express it. The upload, she said, it went through clean. Clean enough. Steady. He had been doing something useful with his fear rather than simply experiencing it. Everything from the past 72 hours, comms logs, access records, the file inquiry on your personal jacket. When your satellite burst came in, it completed the chain. Lund's voice on Crane's frequency. Authenticated this morning. Voice print confirmed against his official comms profile. A pause. He was on the phone with Fitch's logistics coordinator at 0340. We have that too. Elena looked at him for a moment. You cached the server outside Joyce's network 6 hours before the mission. I cache everything outside the primary network. It's habit. It's not just habit, Owen. He said nothing. That was how she knew he understood. The medics had stopped at a respectful distance, waiting. She walked to the Black Hawk, and they fell in beside her, and when one of them reached for her arm on the uneven riverbank, she let him, because the knee was making its opinions known, and there was no strategic value in falling down in front of an extraction team. She did not look back at the ridgeline. She was done with it for now. The flight to Bagram took 47 minutes. Elena sat against the forward bulkhead with a field dressing over the shoulder, a stabilizing brace on the knee, and a blanket she had accepted without comment. One of the medics wanted to start an IV line. She told him the morphine could wait until after she had spoken to whoever was waiting at Bagram, and something in her voice settled the question. Tate sat across from her. He did not fill the flight with talk. He understood she needed the time to prepare, and preparation required silence. She used the time to construct the sequence. Not the facts, she had enough of those. The sequence was the order in which facts became a record that could not be subsequently revised, the architecture of accountability that prevented the institutional management that turned evidence into administrative inconvenience. She had watched that process happen to her father's report in 2003, not the specifics which she had only learned hours ago, but the outcome which she had known since the flat rate box arrived with the postage meter still showing. Crane's warning was still in her. Lund has cover 4 levels up the chain. That was either a fact or a manipulation, and she needed to know which before she started making statements that could be contained rather than investigated. The wheels touched down at Bagram at 0641. There was a woman waiting on the tarmac in a general's uniform. Elena had read the record attached to the 1-star insignia. General Patricia Stone, JSOC. The kind of career that did not produce sentiment and did not reward shortcuts. 30 years of operational positions, intelligence assignments, and the specific credibility that came from being right about hard things in front of people who did not want to hear it. Stone had made enemies in predictable places, which meant she had refused predictable accommodations. Elena walked off the ramp under her own power. Stone looked at her the way experienced senior officers looked at people they were assessing, not at the injuries, not at the rank, but at something that sat in front of rank and was harder to quantify. Then she said, "Walk with me." They walked away from the flight line across a section of tarmac toward a support building whose open door offered privacy without the implication of an interrogation room. Stone did not speak until the door was closed. "You need medical attention," Stone said. "I need 20 minutes first," Elena said. Stone looked at her for a moment. Then she sat down in one of the metal folding chairs lining the wall, which was not what a general typically did, and said, 20 minutes. Elena told her. Not everything 20 minutes was not enough for everything but the load-bearing structure of it, the elements that made everything else comprehensible. The secondary egress grid from Frank's notebook. Lund's voice on Crane's frequency. The 6-year gap between her father's report and this morning. The recording device in the cabin wall. Stone listened without interruption, a focus that registered not just content, but implication, the spaces between facts, as much as the facts themselves. When Elena finished, Stone said, "Crane told you Lund was the reporting authority on your father's incident in 2003. Yes. That's a significant claim from a man with significant motive to redirect your attention. I know, that's why I'm telling you first and not putting it in a sworn statement. Elena held Stone's eyes. If Crane was managing me, he would have said something designed to make me act impulsively. He said something that made me sit still for 6 hours in the dark and think. Those are different kinds of statements. Stone was quiet for a moment. The recording device. Voice activated, 48-hour battery. I activated it in my equipment room at 22:40 on March 18th and placed it in the cabin at 22:57 before the team boarded. Before you knew with certainty what was going to happen. Before I knew with certainty, but Grid 34 SPU was in that briefing packet and it should not have existed in any official document. That was enough. Stone stood. She looked at the floor for a moment, then at the wall, then at Elena with the expression of someone reorganizing their understanding of a situation's dimensions. The device was in the cabin during Crane's conversation with you prior to the egress. Yes. Everything he said, the arrangement, the payment, your father, all of it. Stone picked up the radio on the table and gave a series of instructions in the compressed language of someone who knew exactly which personnel she needed and exactly where they were. When she set it down, she said, "Medical team, Building 6, 12 hours, then your formal statement." Lund was removed from his command position at 05:12 this morning, Stone said. The second aircraft went directly to Joyce. He was in his office completing the incident report on your equipment failure. A pause. He had reached the witness signature section. Elena let that land. The contractors Fitch sent into the valley, she said, being addressed through Afghan National Army coordination. Stone moved toward the door. Right now, your concern is Building 6. Elena walked through the door and into the Bagram morning cold and bright, smelling of aviation fuel and the particular dust that Central Asian air carried at altitude. She had been awake for 31 hours. The shoulder ached with a consistency that had stopped registering as pain and started registering as weather ambient, something you accounted for rather than addressed. The right hand was shaking again. She looked at it as she walked, the fine tremor, persistent, the hand moving slightly against her will. She folded it into a fist, and the tremor continued anyway, indifferent to the instruction. She opened the fist and kept walking. The medical team took 4 hours. A flight surgeon named Kowalski with the bedside manner of a man who had stopped performing reassurance somewhere in his second combat deployment. He examined the shoulder, the ribs, the knee, and the hand in that order, and what his face did during the examination of the hand told her most of what she needed to know before he spoke. The cervical impact, he said, C6 to C7 level. The nerve impingement is causing the tremor. How long to resolve? It may not fully resolve. He said it the way physicians said things they had learned to say without softening, because softening was a form of dishonesty that did patients no favors. Nerve impingement at that level with this degree of trauma, the water impact was essentially a high-velocity axial load through the spine. Some patients recover full function. Some recover partial. Some stabilize at the current level. Current level meaning the tremor is permanent. Current level meaning we need imaging and time to know. What I can tell you now is that the origin is neurological rather than musculoskeletal. There is no surgical option and no rehabilitation program that addresses it directly. He held her eyes. I'm sorry. She looked at her right hand. She thought about her marksman qualification, kept compressed the potential energy of a skill she had decided not to spend. She thought about the 4 adjustments instead of 1 on the antenna shot, the 9-centimeter deviation at 760 meters. She thought about what it meant to hold a first-class marksman rating with a hand that moved when you told it to be still. All right, she said. It was not acceptance. It was acknowledgement, the beginning of the next calculation, not the end of the current one. She had looked at the Peak River from 8,000 feet and made a calculation. She could make this one too. She slept for 9 hours. When she woke, the shoulder had stiffened, and the knee had made the transition from acute to chronic, and the hand was as it was. She lay on the cot for 3 minutes before getting up, the longest she had spent horizontal and conscious since the river, and used the time to think about her father's notebook in the 7 grids in the 6 years between 2003 and this morning. The formal deposition was held the following morning in a JAG conference room. 3 investigators, a court reporter, Stone observing from a chair against the wall. Elena answered every question completely and without embellishment in the direct declarative language that 27 years of learning from a man who did not see value in imprecision had given her. Events in the sequence they had occurred, evidence in the order it had been created. names at the points where names were necessary. When they reached the recording device, the lead investigator stopped the deposition and played the audio. The room was very quiet for the length of the recording. Crane's voice was clear. Her own voice was clear. The sound of the rotors was present, but not overwhelming the voice activation threshold, having been calibrated for operational environments. Every word of the conversation in the cabin was present and intelligible and unambiguous. The lead investigator stopped the playback and looked at his notes, then at Elena. You placed this device before boarding with no certainty of what would occur. Correct. What were you certain of? That something was wrong, she said. That preparation was cheaper than regret. The investigator made a note. 3 days later, in a smaller room, Stone read her the file. Frank Harker had filed a report in October 2003 identifying anomalous movement patterns in Grid 34 SPU and adjacent sectors patterns consistent with the early-stage establishment of a logistics route using terrain that was not officially mapped and therefore not officially monitored. He had named a network facilitator with documented connections to arms trafficking and to parties with American-adjacent financial relationships, suggesting protection from above the operational level. The report had been received by the FOB Joyce Intelligence Office. Lund had been the intelligence officer at Joyce in October 2003. The report had been categorized, filed, and administratively suppressed within 72 hours of submission. Frank Harker had been killed on a patrol to Grid 34 SPU on October 14, 2003, 3 weeks after submitting the report. The patrol had been authorized by the intelligence office. The route had been determined by the intelligence office. Stone read it from a document now unclassified because 3 separate JAG investigators had determined its continued classification served no legitimate protective purpose and several illegitimate ones. When Stone finished, she set the document face down on the table between them. The room held the specific silence of a fact that has been suspected for a long time, finally arriving in a form that cannot be dismissed. Elena had carried the shape of it for 6 years without being able to name it the patrol route that should not have gone where it went. The report that generated nothing, the flat rate box that arrived with the postage meter still showing. She had carried it as a weight whose dimensions she knew without knowing its source. Now she knew. She looked at the document lying face down on the table. She did not turn it over. She had heard everything it contained, and hearing had been sufficient. He reported it correctly, she said. Her voice came out even. She had not planned for it to come out, even it simply did the way things sometimes did when the body understood before the mind caught up that there was still work left and work required steadiness. Yes, Stone said, and Lund processed the report and sent him back to the grid. Yes. Elena put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. The left one steady, the right with its persistent, fine tremor. The two of them side by side like a before and after that had not yet found its resolution. Her father had died doing exactly what he had taught her to do. He had found the truth about a thing, and he had reported it through the correct channels to the correct authority, and the correct authority had been the wrong man, and 3 weeks later Frank Harker was dead in a grid he himself had marked in pencil in a Greenfield notebook that his daughter had carried for 6 years without yet knowing why. She thought about Stills in the diner in Savannah, the coffee he had not touched, the expression of a man carrying information he had decided incorrectly was safer unspoken. What happens to the record, she said finally. My father's report. The suppression. It becomes part of the Lund prosecution, Stone said. The full chain of events documented and entered into evidence. His name will be in the record as the officer who identified the network, who reported it correctly, who was killed for it. Elena nodded once. That was not justice. Justice would have required something no document could provide. But it was the truth made permanent, and permanent truth was something. It was the thing her father had tried to give the chain of command in October 2003, and the chain of command had refused it, and now it was going into a record that would outlast everyone in this room. It was enough. It would have to be. 3 days after the deposition, she called Warren Stills from a secure line at Bagram. It was early morning in Georgia. He answered on the second ring the way he always did. She told him what Stone had read from the document. All of it. The report, the suppression, the patrol route, the grid. She told it to him the way she had told Stone without softening in the direct declarative that Frank had modeled and she had inherited. When she finished, there was a long silence on the line. I knew about the report, Stills said finally. His voice was the voice of a man setting down something he had carried for a long time carefully in the only place it had always belonged. I knew he filed it. I didn't know what happened to it. After he died, I asked twice and was told twice it was under review. I stopped asking because I understood what that meant, and I didn't know what to do with that understanding. You could have told me, Elena said, not as accusation, as fact. Yes. A pause. I thought keeping you out of it was protecting you. Your father thought the same thing about those grids keeping them off the books. We were both wrong about what protection meant. Elena said nothing for a moment. He would be proud of you, Still said, for the right reasons. Not because you survived the fall, because you knew what you were surviving it for. She let that settle. I know, she said. She meant it. Crane and 3 members of his Delta team entered the military justice system facing charges of conspiracy to commit murder conduct, unbecoming an officer and material support to a foreign criminal enterprise. Crane's cooperation with the investigation, including his sworn statement on Frank Harker's report and its suppression, would be considered in sentencing. His account corroborated the documentary record on a point of sequence that would otherwise have required extended forensic reconstruction. Lund was charged with treason. The prosecution did not expect to be constrained by the sentencing structure. Doyle Mercer was not charged. He had declined to fire on a fellow soldier and declined to report her position on 3 separate occasions, and had subsequently provided sworn testimony that corroborated key elements of the prosecution's case against both Crane and Lund. His record would reflect a formal commendation for moral courage in a situation that had offered him easier choices. He was assigned to a stateside training billet, and his name would not appear in any public account of what had happened in the Kunar in March 2009. Elena thought about the magazine pouch on the gravel bar, the deliberate 30 seconds before Mercer set it down and walked on, the radio placed on the ground and the 3 backward steps and the silence that was the most complete form of communication available to a man in that situation. She would have liked to shake his hand. She suspected she never would, and that Mercer would consider that appropriate and that he would be right. Roland Fitch was apprehended 11 days after the events in the Kunar, based on information derived from Crane's cooperation. The network he had facilitated 4 years of weapons movement through terrain that should have been closed in 2003 was effectively dismantled over the following 8 months. The 3 private contractors he had sent into the valley were detained by Afghan National Army forces and transferred to American custody. They were not relevant to what happened afterward. The formal determination on Elena's hand came from the medical board 6 weeks after the river. 3 physicians, 2 neurologists, and occupational therapist. The tremor had not resolved. Nerve regeneration at the C6 to C7 level was partial and had plateaued. The functional deficit was permanent at current levels. She was no longer qualified for the marksman role she had voluntarily declined to occupy for 5 years. The medical board offered her a medical retirement with full honors. The paperwork was thorough and respectful, written in language that recognized extraordinary circumstances without fully capturing them, because the language available for such acknowledgments had been designed for situations that did not quite apply here. She read it once and set it aside. Stone came to her quarters that evening. Not in uniform, which Elena noted. She brought coffee, which she drank and sat in the spare chair and looked at the space between them with the comfortable directness of a woman not uncomfortable with silence. After a while, Stone said, "There is another option." Elena waited. "There is a unit that has been in development for 14 months. Its function is the identification and interruption of networks operating within or adjacent to the American military structure, networks, that require someone who can read terrain and evidence and institutional behavior simultaneously." Stone paused. "The kind of network that operated for 6 years at Joyce because no one applied the right kind of attention to it." Elena looked at the coffee in her hands. "What kind of unit?" "The kind that does not officially exist in a way that limits its operational scope." Stone met her eyes. "The kind that needs someone who knows what it looks like when the paperwork has been written before the event it describes." "Someone who can prepare for the worst case," Elena said. "Someone who already has." Elena looked at her right hand. The tremor was present, consistent, no longer surprising. She had spent 6 weeks learning its specific vocabulary, which tasks it affected and which it did not, which compensations worked and which were false economy, where the line was between what the hand could do and what it could not. She had begun shooting left-handed 3 weeks earlier. The first session at the range at Bagram, alone at 0600, with an M24 she had signed out on her own authority. The first round had landed 18 centimeters wide at 200 meters. She had written the number in Frank's notebook in the back after the last of the 7 grids. She had adjusted her grip and her stance in the position of her head and shot again. The second round had landed 12 centimeters wide. She had written that number too. She looked at Stone. "Building 9, she said, Fort Bragg." Stone nodded. There was nothing ceremonial in the moment. No speech, no assembly, no formally concluded observance. There were only two women in a room at Bagram Coffee that had gone cold, and a decision made in the same quiet, deliberate way. All the decisions in this story had been made, not because the circumstances were simple, but because the alternative was to let the circumstances make the decision first. Elena arrived at Fort Bragg on a Tuesday in early June 2009. The light in North Carolina that morning was nothing like Afghanistan. Softer, more diffused, the air heavy with moisture, and the particular greenness of a landscape that received enough rain to be itself without apology. She found the building without help. It was not marked with the number 9 or with anything else. She had been given a physical description and a grid reference, which she thought was appropriate. A man was waiting at the entrance. Late 50s, the posture of someone whose body had been shaped by decades of work that left specific marks. He did not introduce himself by rank or name. He looked at her for a moment and then held the door open. She walked through it. That evening in the single room, she had been assigned in a building with no official designation. She sat at the desk and opened her father's notebook to the back section. To the 7 grids. She had a pen in her left hand. She added an 8th grid. The coordinate of the flat section of Riverbank on the Pech where the Black Hawk had landed, and Owen Tate had stood in the door looking across the distance for her. She dated the entry. Below the coordinate, she wrote 4 words in the spare notation Frank had used, the shorthand of someone who did not believe in wasting ink on things already understood. She closed the notebook. Through the window, the North Carolina evening was settling into dark in the unhurried way of places not at altitude, the temperature dropping in degrees rather than the sudden mountain intervals she had learned to anticipate. Somewhere on the base, a formation was being dismissed for the evening, the faint echo of commands carrying through the still air. She took the M24 from its case and set it on the desk. She picked it up with her left hand, adjusted her grip, settled the stock against her shoulder, and found the natural alignment that the left side was still building toward, not yet instinctive, not yet automatic. The repetition not yet sufficient to make the knowledge live in the hand rather than the mind. Not yet. She walked out to the range behind the building. Dark, empty at this hour. She set up at the first bench 200 meters to the target and fired her first round of the evening and walked down to check the mark and wrote the number in the notebook beside the date. 11 centimeters wide. She walked back to the bench. She adjusted. She fired again. She wrote that number too. Then the next and the one after that, each entry, a data point and a calculation that had no fixed endpoint, only the ongoing work of closing the distance between where she was and where she intended to be. On the 9th round, the mark landed 7 centimeters wide. She wrote it down. She wrote them all down, every number in every session in the back of her father's notebook after the 8 grids, because Frank Harker had understood that the record of a thing was part of the thing itself, that what you documented, you honored, and what you honored, you continued. The range was quiet around her, no one watching, no one measuring, no external standard against which progress was being calibrated. Just the work in the notebook and the steady subtraction of centimeters from a distance that was closing one round at a time. She had survived the fall. She had come back from it. She had done what needed doing with what the fall had left her. Now she was doing the next thing. That had always been enough.